Hello, everyone. Welcome to Unit 4. This is on consumption. And the major issues we're going to be talking about here, as you've already seen by reading, is animal rights, environmentalism, and population ethics. So each of these articles has a pretty straightforward argument. I hope they weren't too difficult, but we'll go over them in a little bit more detail, and then you'll get to do your discussion posts. And given that this is the last unit, we want to make sure that you have started on your papers or have at least looked over the topics. After this unit, I've given a couple days extra space just to work on your papers so that you'll have ample time. And they're really short papers, especially for a college course, but again, just given the time constraints, I want to make sure that you could do a really good job on the papers. So go ahead and get started on that after you're done with Unit 4. And thanks for watching all these videos. I know they haven't been the greatest, but I've tried, so hopefully they were at least somewhat useful to you guys. All right, so let's talk about Singer. So Singer is making an argument for the inclusion of animals in our ideas about what constitutes moral consideration. So he starts off by talking about sort of the Black liberation movement or civil rights movement, where we think that where previous generations have maybe erred by not including certain human groups in moral consideration by either dehumanizing them and making them seem less than human, or by subjugating them just because of the color of their skin, or even, for women, their sex. We've seen that, throughout history is replete with the idea that certain groups of people are inferior to other groups of people, and that this affords us the ability to use them in some way, or it should not give them the same sort of rights. And Singer thinks that these arguments are obviously bunk, and he wants to sort of explore the idea that maybe leaving out animals is equivalent to leaving out disadvantaged groups of people, and that we shouldn't be doing this. And when we go into our moral deliberation, we should also be considering animals. So he starts by thinking about types of criteria that we might use to include things in our moral consideration. So when we want to think about what types of beings are going to be included in moral calculation, when we're thinking about moral problems, like, for example, we probably don't think about rocks when we're going throughout our day-to-day and making moral decisions. Like, we don't think about using a street path over a natural path because we won't have to step on rocks, because we don't think rocks are the types of things that deserve moral consideration. So what criteria can we use, or what criteria do we use in deciding what counts as being part of our moral consideration? So Singer lists some possibilities. One possibility is maybe mental capacities. So perhaps why we don't take rocks into consideration, but we take humans into consideration, is that human beings have certain mental capacities, like the ability to sort of represent our external environment in a certain way, or our ability to reason, or our ability to make and receive arguments and change our mind based upon them, our ability to use logic to come to conclusions from sets of premises, our ability to make long-term plans, short-term plans. All these sorts of mental capacities, one might argue, are what give us the foundation for arguing that human beings deserve to be treated as moral beings. But rocks, they don't have this type of mental capacity, therefore they do not deserve to be in moral consideration. And this argument has also been made sort of traditionally for why animals aren't considered in moral calculations. So Descartes, who was a French philosopher, historically argued that animals are sort of robots or automatons, and they don't have the same ability to reason and to represent the external world to the extent and level that human beings do, and therefore they don't deserve our moral consideration. Of course, as we learn more about biology, and especially as we learned more as a society about how animals are set up and what types of capacities they have, we quickly realize that this isn't entirely true. We know that the higher apes, for example, have the ability to reason pretty effectively about a variety of things. They can use tools. They can come to conclusions based on things they see in their environment. And so on the one hand, we have this claim that animals really do have a lot higher mental capacities than we initially thought, and perhaps in the future thought, or in our history thought. On the other hand, we also have this claim that Singer is making that animals sometimes have higher mental capacities than certain human beings do. So there are certain groups of human beings, whether they are born, mentally retarded, or they have growth stints, or they are in a coma, or they, for whatever reason, are lacking certain mental capacities. So, for example, someone in a coma, that even someone who's not likely to get out of one, we still think that they deserve moral consideration. We think that pulling the plug isn't just something that we can do without thinking about the moral benefits and costs associated with it. And we don't generally think that people who are born with serious mental deficiencies are any less deserving of our moral consideration. We tend to think that they are equally, if not sometimes more deserving of our moral consideration, because they might not be able to make all of the choices that we're able to make by themselves, and instead they need our help. So maybe we're owed some extra duties to them. But Singer wants to reject this idea that mental capacities could possibly be the reason, because, as he says, some human beings don't have very high quality or highly skilled mental capacities because of various defects. And we tend to think we have brutally underestimated the amount of mental capacities that some animals possess. So therefore, it can't be mental capacities that give us some reason to privilege human beings in our moral consideration while restricting animals from that. And this might seem like more rather common sense to other people. You certainly think that your dog deserves moral consideration. But what Singer wants to say is all types of animals, whether they're domestic or not, have moral consideration. So when we go to decide what we're going to eat, we might think twice before ordering a steak, given that a steak is an animal. We might think twice about buying meat from factory farms in the first place, although because of their treatment of animals, all these sorts of considerations that would go into how we would treat other human beings, he wants to argue also apply to animals. So there is one sort of way to restrict the domain to just human beings, and that is to say that the only types of beings that should be considered for, in our moral calculations are those that are included in Homo sapiens. But Singer says this is completely arbitrary, and we shouldn't think that this is any reason to restrict them, because the idea is that we could restrict this group to anything, right? We could restrict it to white males, we could restrict it to people of a certain religion, or we could restrict it to people from a certain area. All of these restrictions are completely arbitrary, especially given how closely related we are to some animals, right? So the idea is that any group that is based off of a species or a race or a sex is going to be arbitrary and ill-founded for a foundation for moral consideration. So Singer says, the only real plausible criterion is sentience. So sentience is this ability to feel pleasure and pain, and this is what we should use as a basis for moral consideration. This helps us determine why we think our dog or cat deserve moral consideration, but rocks don't, because rocks have no ability to feel pleasure or pain, but my dog does, or my cat does, or other animals do. Even animals that we don't typically domesticate, like cows or monkeys, or any of the types of animals that can feel pleasure or pain, even if they don't have a lot of mental capacities. So you might think that maybe fish feel pain, but they don't have a lot of mental capacities that we do, especially the more simple fish. So therefore, but they do feel pleasure and pain, so therefore Singer says they deserve our moral consideration. And the idea here is that if we're using sentience as our criterion for moral consideration, then this opens up lots of questions about our practices, especially about our eating practices, about how we treat animals, because a lot of these practices might be undermined by the idea that animals deserve the same amount of moral consideration as human beings do, because they have the same ability to feel pleasure and pain that we do. So this is Singer's argument in a nutshell. He goes in depth to the various steps of it, but the basic premise is that sentience is our foundation, or the criterion that we're going to use to deliver moral consideration to various beings. And if this is right, then we ought to afford all animals, including human beings, the same amount of moral consideration. And thus the title, All Animals Are Equal. So I went through that a little quickly, but I think the argument's pretty straightforward. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me about that piece. So let's talk a little bit about Parfit on overpopulation. So Parfit's piece is going to examine sort of the ethical questions that surround overpopulation. What types of restrictions do we want to place on our population? Is it better to restrict how much we're repopulating the world? What types of benefits and costs are associated with overpopulation? And he wants to do this from a really abstract perspective. So he's not technically interested in any real world necessary problems. He's more interested about how we reason about overpopulation in general. So we'll see how this works as we go on, but it's important to realize that he's coming at this from like a very broad point of view, rather than drawing on data from a specific nation and the resources and analyzing how our use of resources might land us in trouble. So he says the conclusion that he wants to drive home is this like repugnant conclusion, right? But he starts off with this sort of simple exercise. He says, let's compare two worlds, A and B, and you see them there on your screen. A, the height of the bar from top to bottom represents the amount of happiness that each, that the population has. He's not very specific about whether it's like an individual, the average for the individual, or just like the total happiness. The idea is that I guess it does have to be the average for the individual, right? Because his point is that for all the individuals that are in A, we think that they have a slightly better life. So there's two sort of competing worlds. The first is A, where there is a slightly less population, which is shown by the width of the bar, versus B, which has is slightly wider and therefore has a slightly larger population, or significantly larger depending on the types of numbers we want to use, but it has a little bit less happiness. So there's a few ways we could reason about which one is worse. So he's not terribly concerned about the moral implications of this sort, but just like on average, which world would we prefer? Would we prefer A, where there's less people, but more happiness per individual, or would we prefer B, where there is more people but slightly less happiness for each individual person? So one principle we could use is if other things are equal, it is better if people's lives go on average better. So think about all the considerations we might have, and whichever world has the average person's life going better, we might think that world's better. So that's called the average principle. And he wants to move to this hedonistic total principle. Hedonistic means it's just like a pleasure calculus. So you're just adding up the pleasure that each person's experiencing and doing some sort of, quote unquote calculus with it and determining which one's better. So the idea is for the total principle, if other things are equal, it is better if there's a greater total sum of happiness. So the idea would be, if there's more people and they're only slightly less happy, then we have to prefer the world in which there are more people that are slightly less happy, given that their lives are all meaningful to live. So he says, look, there are obviously times to the quality of life given to us by the amount of resources that we have. Excuse me. Such that we wouldn't want to live in that world anymore. We say, no, it's probably better that that person not be born because they're going to suffer so much that we think it's probably better if they had never been born. But he's saying, given that we assume this baseline where their lives are still worth living, even if they're slightly less happy, we might think that, a world like B is preferable to A because there's going to be a greater total sum of happiness because there are going to be more people to experience that. So this is where, basing off of this, he wants to move. So if we say that B is preferable to A, right, because there's a greater total sum of happiness, the repugnant conclusion is that compared with the existence of very many people, say 10 billion, all of whom have a very high quality of life, there must be some much larger number of people whose existence, if other things are equal, would be better, even though those people would have lives that are barely worth living. So the idea here is so let's say that B is better than A because there's going to be according to the total principle, there's going to be more people and a greater total happiness because of the more people that have, just a slightly lower happiness. So if that's right, then we also move from B to C. So in C, there's going to be more people than in B, but they're going to have a slightly lower happiness. We're going to say that C is preferable to A or to B because there's going to be more people and there's going to be a greater sum total of their happiness. So, intuitively we might think 8 billion people who are, averagely happy at around, say they, rate it 5 out of 10, this might be better than 200 million people that are at the, that rate their happiness 6 out of 10 or something. So this is just based off that total principle, right? The idea that what we're looking for is not just the average person's quality of life, but this greater sum total of happiness among all people. And that if people who have lives that are still worth living, even if barely so, if there are a lot more of them, then we might think that that world's preferable. Although it's supposed to be, the answer here is supposed to be non-intuitive. So it's supposed to be a repugnant conclusion. It's supposed to be like, I don't think we should prefer Z to, say, A, right? We want to say that maybe A is better because there's this greater happiness among them. So, but if we accept the total principle, which Parfit thinks we should, then we get this repugnant conclusion. So he introduces this mere addition paradox, which is closely related to the repugnant conclusion. So here he says, let's imagine A and B again, but we also have A plus and B minus. So A plus is a world in which we have the same bar, so that we have the same population of, say, 10 million people that are very happy. They live pretty good and meaningful lives. But then we have this other world that's distinct from that world. So there's no relationship between that 10 million people's happiness and, say, this other 2 million people. And these 2 million people, they have a life that's maybe not quite as, it's let's say barely worth living, right? Like it's not great, but it's definitely it still contains happiness. So we'd say A plus is certainly not worse than A, because A plus is just that world with another world, or a sort of detached population. So the reason the detached population is important is you don't want it to become like an Omelas type situation, right? Like the city we saw last time, where the lives and the pleasure of the 10 million people rely on the crappy lives of the people that are, in the second bar of the A plus. So it's important that they're distinct in that it's just more people that are removed from them, and they're sort of, their lives are still worth living, but they're not, their unhappiness is not contributing in any way to the first bar's happiness. However, most people would think that B is better than A plus. So the idea here is that A plus and B have the same total population. So you would combine those two bars of A plus. So it would be like half the population's really happy and half the population's like their lives are still worth living, but they're not that happy. Whereas B would bring us that same population would all be considered together as being pretty happy, not as happy as that first bar of A plus, but say they're much happier than the part of the population of A plus that's not very happy. So the idea is it's better to raise everyone up to the same level than to have these really distinct differences in happiness among the population in A plus, even if they are detached from each other. So taken together, these beliefs imply that B is not worse than A. So B cannot be worse than A if it is better than something, A plus, which is not worse than A. So remember, we don't think that A plus is worse than A because it's just A with another world that seems to be just as, they're not miserable, but their lives are still worth living. In fact, we might even have the intuition that A plus is slightly better because more people exist and that have meaningful lives. However, this also implies that B is not worse than A, because if A plus is not worse than A, but A plus is, sorry, this is getting confusing. So remember, we think that B minus is, or that B is preferable to A plus. But B cannot be worse than A if it is better than something. So if B is better than A plus, then it also should be better than A, right? Because the idea is that, sorry, this is very confusing. So B cannot be worse than A if it is better than something, A plus, which is not worse than A. So we don't think that there's any difference between A and A plus. And we think that B is also not worse than A. So this is the what's called the mere addition paradox. So the idea is, how do we get from all of these beliefs taken together imply a contradiction? So it's not clear what we're supposed to give up in that situation. I'm sorry. So Parfit's just kind of introducing this repugnant conclusion. He offers one sort of possible way out at the end, which he calls perfectionism, which is the idea that maybe just all lives matter a lot. And I don't want to talk about that at length here, just because it's introducing a whole nother can of worms that I don't think is vitally important. I think what's most important is to see this sort of repugnant conclusion that comes from accepting the total principle and then thinking about how these paradoxes are going to play out. All right. So let's talk about Sober on environmentalism. Sober is criticizing, or not criticizing, he's wondering what type of motivation environmentalists have for taking seriously the proposition that we ought to protect nature or parts of nature. So the idea here is that there's a problem for the environmentalist position to be sensible. It's called the demarcation problem. It must do these three things, which seem really hard to do, given the sorts of problems that he later raises. So one thing they have to do is identify which things matter morally and which do not. So the idea here is, in order for an environmentalist to identify what we should protect, he also has to identify which things should matter to us at all in a moral consideration. So similar to what we were talking about with Singer, right? He's wondering how, but here he's wondering how do environmentalists, people who want to save certain areas, save certain species, protect certain environments from deforestation or the like, he's wondering how do environmentalists determine which things matter morally and which do not. Additionally, environmentalists are saddled with the responsibility to explain which properties or features those individuals have that give rise to our moral duties toward them. So the idea is that once you've demarcated which things matter morally and do not, you got to say, well, what is it about those things that give rise to our moral responsibility or our moral duties. So what is it about trees that gives rise to my duty to protect them from deforestation? What is it about saving the red panda, or what is it about the red panda that requires that I save them? Or what is it about the rhinoceros such that we should outlaw poaching? So the environmentalist is saddled with the idea, with not only determining which things matter morally and which do not, but also identifying the properties or features of those things that give rise to our moral duties. And Sober's careful to say that this cannot result in the conclusion that we have moral obligation towards all things. So it can't be that we have a moral obligation to dirt or rocks, just, or everything, because this would be absurd. He thinks the conclusion that we have a moral responsibility towards every single thing in the environment is just nonsensical. And it leads to this absurd conclusion. So they can't have it lead to this absurd conclusion, but they still have to identify what we do have moral responsibility towards and why we have a moral responsibility towards those things. So here are some candidates and his replies to them. And this is sort of the bulk of the rest of his piece, is presenting potential candidates for what environmentalists could say and showing why those might not work. So this is why his paper is called Some Philosophical Problems for Environmentalism, is because he's proposing these candidates that he hears people often referring to when they're talking about why we have to save something and saying, well, that doesn't quite work. So, for instance, suffering is, this is Singer's reason for giving more animals moral consideration generally. But here, Sober is implying that some environmentalists use this as, a way to defend their either stopping intervention in nature or destroying an environment or something. So he says, look, this clearly cannot work for a lot of the environment that people want to save. So when we want to save a natural park, or we want to save the face of a mountain from, not putting a highway over it, or we want to save a large oak tree from getting cut down, we can't use suffering as our rationale because presumably oak trees don't suffer. So there's some interesting research about, plants evading predators and stuff that you might have seen, but we probably still don't think that plants can suffer in the same way that human beings or animals can, or at least it's plausible to think that. So the idea is this can't be the reasoning for a lot of the environment, and even when we just restrain our scope to animals, it doesn't seem like this gets an environmentalist all of the things they want. So when they want to save a certain species, they might think that, it might think that killing a endangered species is worse than killing an equivalent of a species that has a lot of them, or too many even of them. So, for example, killing a bald eagle to a lot of environmentalists is going to be a lot worse than killing a pigeon. And you can't explain this by referencing suffering, because presumably both of those creatures are going to suffer around the same. You need some extra justification or extra reason for thinking that killing the bald eagle is worse than killing the pigeon. Another reason that environmentalists often give for not interfering with nature or not injuring a species is just sort of this claim about ignorance. Even if we can't know what a species is good for now, they say we ought to protect it in case that further research shows it's good. So, for example, even though we don't know the benefits of having this certain breed of monkey around right now, we might figure out later that it keeps populations of poisonous snakes down or something. And this would have better benefits on various other creatures or something like that. The idea is that even if we don't know something now, we might, through scientific investigation, learn something about the environment such that it would give us a good reason for saving it. Sober's response here is that this is an irrational form of thinking, because we can't. It's absurd to think that we have a reason to not intervene or to not preserve a species based on this potential gain. He says, look, we take calculated risks all the time. If there's some benefit, say we by killing off this one species, we save, this village from suffering. I don't know. Just imagine some perceived benefit of interfering with nature, or even take a less extreme example. So we want to build a hospital over this rainforest, and we don't think that this part of the rainforest is necessarily going to house any. By building the hospital, we aren't necessarily killing any species. We're just killing this part of this rainforest. The idea that we might learn something about the specific part of the rainforest later that would give us reason to not build that hospital, Sober says, is not a reason to not build the hospital, because we take calculated risks like this all the time. He says we do things without perfect knowledge because the benefits we see now outweigh any costs we see now, even if we can't see all of the costs because maybe we don't know about all the connections. And he says this is a rational thing to do because we can't always stall action because we don't have perfect knowledge. If you had to do this in your day-to-day life when making moral decisions, you would never be able to act because you would always have some further consideration that you think could possibly give you evidence against what you might do. So the idea is ignorance won't work because it just undermines so much of what we do normally in our moral considerations and moral deliberations that it just doesn't make sense to cite it as a reason for not interfering in the environment. So another argument that environmentalists sometimes launch is a slippery slope argument. So once we start the destruction of the environment, it's hard to know when to stop. Sober gives this, I think, a funny example about the eating chips. So once you shouldn't open a bag of chips because once you eat one, you're going to want to finish off the bag, right? I think that's Pringles' motto is like, once you pop, we won't be able to stop or something. And Sober says that once we start destroying the environment, we might just destroy it all, right? We won't know when to stop. Sober says this is false and misleading a form of reasoning, and it's principally based on this claim about vagueness that just doesn't work. So he says, look, say you have 10,000 hairs on your head. At what point would you go bald? And the argument is presumably you would need to lose all your hair before you can be bald, but we don't think that one hair on a head is a particularly good candidate for someone who's being full haired, and we don't think that 7,000 hairs is particularly bad for someone having hair, right? We think that's a pretty good head of hair. So the idea that we can't make a particular cutoff, so we can't say at 100 hairs or less you'll be considered bald or something like that, or not having a lot of hair. The idea that we can't draw a definitive line doesn't mean we can't have good reasons for thinking that someone with 8,000 strands of hair is someone with a full head of hair, and someone with 10 hairs is practically bald. So we can make distinctions even with vagueness that aren't necessarily irrational. So the same reasoning applies to the environment. Even if we can't draw a specific cutoff line when we should stop harming the environment, maybe there are some general guidelines that we can use to figure out when it's a good place to stop. Like maybe we shouldn't deforest all of the forests. That's probably bad, and it's probably bad. Given scientific research, we might have imperfect guesses about what would be an overall negative, but we can still make these sorts of general rules or general guidelines for making decisions. And this slippery slope argument doesn't go through if we think you can make sort of general guidelines about it. So another argument that environmentalists sometimes make, and the last one we'll talk about here, is this intrinsic value argument. So maybe there's this idea that, look, nature just has intrinsic value. Things that appear in nature just have intrinsic value because they're there. And Sober has sort of two lines of argument against this. The first one is it's not exactly clear what type of value it is. So is it just value because they're there? Because we might think that some parts of nature, like for instance a forest fire that just appears, has a lot of negative value. So it can't just be that like all things in nature have intrinsic value, because a forest fire that starts in nature, we might think that's a bad thing, especially if it's going to destroy a lot of nature. So it's not clear exactly what type of value it has. Like, is it another consideration is it valuable to a valuer, like a person? Because it seems like in order for something to have value, someone needs to be able to appreciate that value. So even if we grant that the environment has intrinsic value, just because, say, human beings like looking at it or something like this, Sober says, look, it's not clear that this value is going to get us very far because this sorts of value can be overridden pretty easily. So we might think that the original Mona Lisa has a lot of value, not only just for being the original work of art, but also just because it's a beautiful painting and it's a great painting. So we might think originally that, look, this has a lot of value and we should do a lot of things to preserve it. But imagine that you're in a house and that you own the Mona Lisa from some weird action, right? Because surely the Mona Lisa will never end up in someone's residential house. But just for the sake of the example, assume that you have the Mona Lisa in your house, and your house is burning, and your mom is asleep, and maybe she's injured, or she can't reasonably get out by herself, and you only have time to save either the Mona Lisa or your mother. Almost everyone would say, look, you got to save your mother. Saving the Mona Lisa is not very important in that regard. Because look, her life is more valuable than the Mona Lisa, even if we think the Mona Lisa has some value. The same would apply if you imagine that there's a rare snail in the house, and you're the owner of like one of maybe a dozen snails in the world. And you have to choose between saving the snail or saving your mom. The obvious and sort of overwhelming answer seems to be you should save your mom in this instance. So the idea is that even though the snail is special and has this sort of intrinsic value, the intrinsic value is so low because in these sorts of circumstances, you're going to think that saving your mom is better than saving the snail. So when these evaluations, intrinsic values of the Mona Lisa and the snail or various features of the environment are overridden for largely human considerations or just more important things, you might think that a lot of the environmentalist claims start to be undermined. Because if the things we're going to do benefit human beings a lot, then the intrinsic value of the environment better be pretty high. However, when we start directly comparing them, it seems to be obvious to most of us that the sorts of human preferences, or maybe even like if you disregard the human example, like your dog versus the Mona Lisa, or your dog versus the snail, you're going to think that saving something that's more important to you personally is going to be more important. So the idea here is that the intrinsic value thing, even if we grant that you can get intrinsic value, it's just not clear how far it gets us in these environmentalist arguments. So that was a sort of rough shot over all of those three pieces, but I wanted to give you guys an overview of those arguments. They're all sort of concerning our consumption and our relationship to not only the environment, but to animals, and more broadly to the population's relationship to the environment more generally, and to how we should think about overpopulation in general. So those are the three papers that we read. Go ahead and take the quiz and do the discussion post. And thanks for an enjoyable class. If you even watch these videos, I hope you do. But I really enjoyed it with y'all. Get to work on your papers, and we're almost done. Just a little further. All right, thanks, everyone.